Today on An Imperfect Leader, my guest is Dan James, founder of Story 19 Consulting. Now, before doing his current work, Dan spent 16 years as a U.S. Paralympic coach for wheelchair tennis, an experience that shaped his deep understanding of leadership, of communication, and of human potential. Dan, welcome to An Imperfect Leader.
Oh my gosh, Peter, thank you so much for having me. This is truly an honor.
I'm really excited to talk with you, and it's so nice to meet you, and I'm grateful to my friend Dave Buck, who heard you speak and said that we should connect. So thank you, Dave. I know you listen to the show. Thank you, Dave. I loved visiting your website. I loved listening to some of the conversations you've had with others about your work. And it's this that told me that we'd really enjoy getting together. It's Dan helps technically minded professionals translate their brilliance, which we're going to get to in a few minutes. But I just wanted to get out of there and say, that is so cool. But I first want to think about the purpose of this podcast in particular, which is about extending leader longevity. We know from Rachel White's work at the University of Texas, Austin, that superintendents nationally, they only last about 3 years before they start looking for new jobs. And that's even less if you're a leader of color, if you're a woman in leadership. And so with that knowledge, one thing that leaders need to think about is really deepening their ability to share leadership. And I read that you believe leaders should empower independence rather than control every move, which I do play some tennis, so I was thinking about that as well. I actually, as a side thought, who is it, the coach of the Golden State Warriors? Steve Kerr. He has all of his players read this book about tennis that
the inner game.
I think that's right.
It's a great book.
It's not too big. I read it once, and I've also listened to him. There's an audio version of it as well. It's pretty fantastic.
I think it's from the 80s, Peter.
It's not a new book, but
it has stood the test of time, which has so many implications about human psyche as much as we've grown and developed, that procedurally in thought process and the way we take in emotion and process that into action is still meaningful in the same way it was when that book was written. So it's really an incredible book.
I'm so glad to hear you say that. I remember one of my big takeaways was the sort of imposter syndrome voice that we hear in our heads, and so that was one piece. And then sort of that there are components that you can turn into somewhat a muscle memory, which in the leadership model that I subscribe to, it's sort of this nested pattern of that there are patterns to behavior and there are patterns to reactions and interactions, and that you can do them. So at any rate, I do want to get into shared leadership though. In any system, and of course school systems, the language or coaching moves can really help a superintendent encourage that kind of autonomy for their principals, autonomy for their district leaders. And I just wonder, what advice do you have for leaders who are really engaging in that kind of work?
I think the first is to just assess how you are engaging your teams. There's an automatic assumption from both sides of sameness. And yet the art of being a subject matter expert in teaching is vastly different than leading a school system. And there is a disconnect, whether it is business, school districts, sport teams, in the leadership model and the subject matter expert model. And one of the really important things, whether it's longevity, scaling success, creating a healthy environment, is to bridge that gap, to develop a level of understanding so everybody is meeting in the right place.
I want you to expand on that just a little bit, because if I understand correctly, so many of us have been content experts, and then we're thrust into these leadership positions. And in some cases, you're going from maybe a classroom of 30 to all of a sudden a school of 300 to then a district of 30,000. And what works in one place in terms of maybe relationship doesn't necessarily work when it comes to systems thinking. And I imagine all the different people that you coach and support have to be thinking about the systems they'll build and the feedback loops, or it goes down to, I don't know, part of me thinks it goes down to trust, but then also, as you started your answer, it made me also think about their individual values versus the collective values that they're going to then sort of assign to themselves or agree to.
I think it's really interesting that as people become leaders, and as people are leaving from subject matter experts or SMEs, they don't understand the difference to doing versus leading. And I find that in every industry I work with, that the transition from an individual contributor to a leader, there tends to be a gap. And in my very honest assessment of myself, when I went from being a tennis coach to a leader, I never bridged that gap. And I can say with all honesty, in my first 3 years of high-level leadership, I was really imperfect. And so to look at that and say, okay, I need to bridge that gap with everybody, right? And so we do that on a 4-scale model. We start as leader of things or as an individual contributor, a teacher, right? A coach, whatever that is, but we're contributing directly. Then we become a leader of the individual contributors or leader of people. That's your principal, right? Leading the teachers and making sure that the classes are on board and we have a collective. When we get to leader of scale, which would be a superintendent, we talk about cascading leadership, where my direct touch isn't as big as it used to be with a classroom of 30, but the cascading effect of that is 30,000. And it's really important that as we make that transition, we understand that bridging that gap and creating that skill is more than. It's an additional skill that has to be done in order to create impact at a leadership of scale level.
I think what you've just said is beautiful, and it is totally, you've put words to sort of my rambling about going from 30 to 300 to 30,000 is exactly that. I think the downside for any of us who have moved into the role of the cascading leadership is we sometimes lose connection with the people most impacted by decisions because we're at this level. And when I think about shared leadership, and I imagine you would ascribe to this idea, is how do we keep dipping down into and making sure that we don't lead by title, that we're leading and serving as a lead learner with people as opposed to sort of leading through directive.
I find your term serving to be really apropos here because as a leader, we are serving those we lead, but we're also serving those we are impacting. I do an exercise with everybody I work with, and I ask them, what is your ultimate impact? Not in your job and what you are. What is your ultimate impact in this life? So that I always keep a connection to the impact I'm making to the end user. So for me personally, my ultimate impact is creating vehicles to help people find their best self. That applies in every area of my life. And so I'd ask all the leaders, what's your impact?
I love it.
What is your action? Now, what are your results? What is your next referendum? Why? What is the impact you're trying to create? And if you can have a relationship to that, that why is also a little bit of retention. It's inspiration so that there's always a why in the job you're doing.
And it's focus. I mean, we call
100%.
it in the leadership model that I use, we call it moral focus. Why do you get up in the morning? It's not because you were trying to pass a levy or you were trying to implement a reading program. It was, what is your moral focus? And for mine, it has always been to end poverty. To whatever degree that I could use my influence, affluence, whatever it is, how I might be able to take advantage of the blessings I've been born with and to share them, not in any sort of as this benevolent, but rather really to disrupt the system so that we all have an equitable chance, whatever that might mean and however that might look. So I appreciate that you brought that up.
Well, I love that because as you look at this, perhaps the most base, simple statement a person can make, I'd like to end poverty. How much can filter down below that? How many action items, how many choices, how many relationships? And the beauty of that is that becomes the beacon. Why am I doing this? To end poverty, to create the best self for every individual.
Yeah.
And that's the beacon in our choice making, in the way we develop systems, because that's the impact we're trying to make.
If you're just joining us, our guest today is Dan James, the founder of Story 19 Consulting. And in the leadership model that I use to advise others, there is a dimension called the leader's learning work. And inside that dimension, there's a term using the power of language. And Dan, your work is, as we mentioned at the top of the program, is really about helping technically minded professionals translate their brilliance. And essentially, you're leveraging the power of language. And I imagine you use framing and scenario building and metaphors and storytelling. You've said that everything we say is a story. And I just love that idea. Superintendents have to do something very similar. They have to take complex data, policies, budgets, and they have to make them understandable for their community, for teachers, for parents, and for students who will one day inherit their system as parents themselves. So I guess there's a big question, but what might be some advice that you give leaders on using language and storytelling to really bridge that gap?
Peter, if I'm honest, I have a huge advantage because in working with technically minded people as a former tennis coach, I get to very authentically say, hey, I don't get it. Please talk to a tennis pro. But really the advice is, the advice becomes one of, can you get to 50,000 feet? So stop getting granular at the beginning. When we start talking about buy-in and alignment, it doesn't start at the granular level. It starts at concept. It starts at 50,000 feet. Can we align on the impact of whatever the subject matter is? And now if we can align on that, I'm interested in delving down into the details. But as communicators, I have to start and assess my audience. And I mean, you might find this interesting. I've outlawed outlines in my life, and I do impact lines. So in every speaking engagement, podcast, difficult conversation, what is the impact I'm trying to make? And I start there. Underneath that are stories and information that can support that impact. That might get into some detail, but it always starts at 50,000 feet with the impact and an assessment of audience.
All right. So my co-host, he listens to my conversations and then he gives me grief for questions I didn't ask. So I can already imagine that Jamie's going to ask, what was the impact statement that he wrote for this podcast conversation? What was something that you thought about in terms of inline?
So it's funny, I was actually doing it right before we went on.
Yeah.
Because I do go through that. And I mentioned to you before we started recording, my father was a superintendent. And so this is...
So you and my son can get sort of engaged in some real therapy about being a superintendent.
Please give him my number. We need to talk. But it is really a lot of my coaching and education philosophy comes from my parents as a teacher and a superintendent. And the impact I really wanted to make was to convey that people in academia, any level, can be great leaders, can create scale of impact to children from every level. And that really was the impact I wanted to make today, to say that is possible in the healthiest and most longevity style way we can. And
I think that's going to totally resonate. Sorry to step on your words.
You're good.
One of the things that I ask every guest each week is to tell me what they think about the term an imperfect leader. And I think this is sort of a really nice sort of pathway from what you've just said in terms of the inline you want to have, and then also potentially what that term means to you. So how does that term resonate for you?
First, I identify with it. As I look back on my career, especially as a coach, I am coaching on the things I failed at and in the things that actually pushed me to get better. And so in my practice, we do not talk about perfection or outcomes. We talk about the pursuit of better. And so we get rid of those outcomes. The outcomes are an ancillary benefit of a process of getting better. And we measure the process, not the outcome. And so as we talk about it, an imperfect leader is always growing, is always getting better. Do they skin their knees? Do they make mistakes? 100% yes, and thank goodness they do, because it is those skin knees that make them better. And so to me, if there is such a thing as a perfect leader, it lives in their imperfection.
We're back for segment 2 of An Imperfect Leader called Imperfect Leadership in After Action. And my guest is Dan James, the founder of Story 19 Consulting. Now, in this segment, we ask our guests to deconstruct a decision that they made, and then what did they learn from it? I might add that I'm excited to talk to you because you've said that failure is the only real vehicle for growth. So that is like exactly what this segment's all about. Dan, what happened?
Peter, I feel like you're putting me on the spot to talk about how I failed. And the biggest challenge with this question is choosing which time. And so one of the things I look at in terms of my own growth is the understanding of the difference between resume and team. And I think one of the bigger mistakes I made was to hire an incredibly talented person who ticked every box in the job description, but in my heart of hearts, I knew wouldn't fit in with the environment we were trying to create. And I hired that person anyway. I want to stress that is not that person's fault. They were incredible, but they didn't fit in to what we were trying to create. And it created discord. And instead of moving us forward and scaling outcomes and improvement, it led to extra debate, disagreement, discomfort. And as talented as that person was, it actually hurt the growth of our team rather than helped.
Wow. I will tell you, superintendents who listen to this program each week I'll get some feedback that say, I need to hear some HR versions, some HR ones. And it's always difficult because you want to honor and respect and value the person that is the subject of the conversation. At the same time, you can speak broadly as well as some specifics. And so as we go through these questions, I'd like to think about, so what got overlooked? And when I ask you that, I'm also going to sort of follow up with, how do you know when it is not a good fit, or like you needed that person to be sort of the agitator for change? Because sometimes status quo is what you're trying to disrupt. And so it sounds like in this sense, not a good fit was everybody, you knew where you were going. You were clear on your moral focus. Everybody was moving that direction. And this individual, while had lots of the technical skills, didn't have the cultural piece that supported that work moving forward? What got overlooked?
I think the value of culture, the value of alignment to an end. And we talked about earlier in the podcast, we talked about ultimate impact. Every team has an ultimate impact. Every person has talents in different pathways to get to that ultimate impact, but it still has to be the same ultimate impact. It still has to be the same outcome that we're all striving for. And as a leader, you strive for different ideas and you strive for other people's brilliance. But alignment on the end goal has to be constant. And when we overlook the culture of process is going to be great, but alignment on the outcome, maybe not. I want to stress that doesn't mean having to pivot or change in the midst of what you're striving for doesn't occur. It means you do it together. And so if someone comes forward with a better idea, you embrace it, you give them credit, and you celebrate it. But you're doing it in a manner that is aligned and positive.
You had said something earlier about, you said, we measure the process, not the outcome. The outcome here was what wasn't ideal. It wasn't satisfactory probably for the individual either. Nobody feels good about it not working out. So you're saying we measure the process. So in this case, you had to revisit the process you use for recruiting and interviewing, I assume.
But 100%, Peter. And I have, in my practice, I have something I challenge all my leaders with called the mirror test. And so when something goes wrong, or clearly not the direction that we perceived it would, what's the first thing you do? And as a leader, that's look in the mirror. What did I do that put us in this position, or what could I have done differently to avoid this outcome? And it is okay to look in the mirror and say, wasn't me. But in this instance, as I looked in the mirror, it was 100% me because I ignored the value of the environment that we work in.
So that's typically the fifth question. What could you have done differently? As opposed to no. So let's just jump there and then I'll ask you a different question after that. But what could you have done differently?
I think that what I should have been measuring the process before the interview in the correct questions. What skills does this person need to have? Absolutely one of the right questions, right? What experience does this person need to have? How do they work? Who are they as a human being? What do they want? And I didn't ask those kinds of questions. I asked the qualification questions. That was it. And so what I would have done differently has been very open to discovering how they work with others, what they actually want out of this position, what they see as an outcome, right? And so instead of spoon feeding what we are, I need to find out what that person is first. And so I would have very much changed the conversation in the interview to one of just more discovery about this person rather than checking off skills and then telling them who we are.
I understand. That makes a lot of sense. I had a principal, I got to sit in on interviews for teacher candidates that they were hiring. She asked to do a really innovative program, which was allowing seniors to do their student teaching as a full year project at her elementary school. And so they would team teach all year with a classroom teacher, and then there would be a gradual release of responsibility at some point so they could solo, as opposed to just sort of going from classroom to classroom and then having this 3-week high stakes sort of irrelevant teaching so that you could check a box that said you did your student teaching. And so she wanted to find the very best, not just anyone who could do their student teaching. And so I sat in on those interviews because this was her innovative idea and it was really smart. And what I saw her do that I had never seen anyone else do, which was before they even interviewed any of the candidates, they walked through the questions that they were going to ask and they came to a shared image of what an ideal answer to that question should be for the culture in their building of what they're trying to create together. And it was just, oh my God, why have I not been why haven't we taken the time to say, we each hear the question, we hear the answer differently, and then we assign a score to it. And then afterwards we start to haggle about whether or not it was a great answer or not a great answer. What if we had done it from the very beginning to say, what is an ideal answer for this question?
And I'll take you a step further because I
Please.
love that. I love that in ways I can't describe, because in the debrief, then the question you get to ask, because you already have the ideal, how does this person make the ideal better?
Ooh,
And so now the debrief, we can even go further with that.
I like that because then you don't get mired in where they fell short in answering it. It's more about, Well,
and if we are imperfect leaders, we are also imperfect in creating job descriptions and ideal candidates. And so if we believe in the pursuit of better and a constant state of learning after every interview, I should be asking how that candidate could make us better and how the way they answered the questions could make us better.
Yeah.
And so
Yeah.
it's a very important part of that process if we're going to continue to grow.
I love it. What did you learn about relationships, or what new relationships formed through that experience?
I would take it to a base level and not talk about relationships in that question. What did you learn?
Listen,
That
I've been doing 4 seasons of that question. So that question is staying, Dan.
that
No, I'm kidding. I'm kidding.
I'm talking for me.
I know.
No,
Sorry. No, wait, hold on. Pursuit is better is we measure the process.
the reality for me is that the basis of that question is the answer, right? And it's such a good question. It's also the answer for me because I didn't think about relationships, right? And so the answer in this circumstance is that I needed to think more about not only the relationships I wanted, but the relationships that could be created. And so what did I learn about relationships? That they are integral to success. We have this thing where we talk about effort. And this amazing leader comes into one of my workshops. I'm super nervous. He raises his hand and said, Dan, define effort. Working hard? I'll tell you what, it's an equation. It is energy multiplied by time. So just because you put in your hours doesn't mean you're giving me energy. The idea of relationships and healthy relationships increases the energy in any environment, which means we want to give more. We don't have to. We want to. And so in the answer to the question of what did you learn about relationships, they are critical to the environment we work in and the degree to which we can achieve our outcomes.
Yeah, they really do increase the sense of belonging. You look at
100%.
who's running out at 4 o'clock, and not that you want everyone staying. It's just that those who linger, who talk, who share, who wish each other well, who want to stay if they see someone struggling and they say, I can give you a little extra time, or what are you working on? How can I help? Do you need any, those types of things? That really speaks to the
I like
organization.
to ask the simple question, do you want to be a part of? And then we have the ... the ellipse. But do you want to be a part of? Whether it is, hey, there's a teacher that has tests coming up next week. Am I going to stay and help? Yes, because I want to be a part of it. I also know that when it's my turn, they will do the same for me. And those are the relationships and the energy we're trying to create, again, to become this mythical high performer. And so I think that's really an important part. When you tell me, what did I learn about relationships? They affect our ability to be great.
In the end, what was something that was good that came out of your experience?
I skinned my knee, Peter, and made a mistake. And my understanding of team development grew exponentially. It was a much more holistic view of creating a team rather than a bunch of people with random skills. And I think I became a better interviewer. Not that I was perfect, because I was a very imperfect leader. But if you were to push me and say, did you get better after that? I would say yes.
Is it fair to add that you leaned into what was probably uncomfortable when you needed to part ways, that you were willing to have a difficult conversation as opposed to allowing something to, I don't know if the word that keeps coming to my head is fester, but it's
I just thought the same word.
The same word,
doesn't-
yeah. I mean, because that assigns like a derogatory term, and I don't mean that. It's just that we often want to avoid the conflict. And so we just keep sort of saying, I think I can get better, or I'll keep talking to that person. And I am certainly not assigning that to anyone other than myself as well, of being like, I refuse to give up on people. And sometimes that's my downfall, because I really am hopeful that things will get better.
I think there's great truth in your greatest superpower is also your greatest downfall. And so as we look at that situation, I also tried, it lasted too long. And we had the tough conversation, but in my heart of hearts to this day, many years later, as we're having this conversation, the blame or responsibility still rests on my shoulders. That person was outstanding and very talented and got a job right away, but the responsibility of fitting into our team was on me. And so again, I still think that the growth moment, probably for both of us, I hope that person learned to ask maybe more intricate questions about the environment they're going to work in, and to say, hey, that was just a wrong fit. It was fine. But hopefully there's growth in being the interviewee as well.
Yeah. What advice would you give to an aspiring leader?
Put on your reading glasses, open up your ears, and learn. I think that leadership is an evolving skill. It has to be done in your voice. And so authenticity in leadership is everything. If you read a book, it's not the answer. It goes into your toolbox. If you come work with me, I will tell you up front, I'm not solving your problems. I'm going to add to your toolbox. It is your responsibility to decide how to implement them. And get more tools, learn, but never apologize or be afraid to be yourself.
Dan, if people want to find you at Story 19 Consulting, how can they do that?
They can email me at dan@mystory19.com or go to my website, www.mystory19.com.
Your website's really engaging. It's quite fun to explore and poke around. Yeah, truly. You've spent some time thinking about it. Our guest today was Dan James, the founder of Story 19 Consulting. And Dan, I always write notes as I'm listening to and just engaged with and just thrilled to meet people. For me, it's just the sort of the skinned my knee, how you healed, what you learned, and then how you continue to thrive and then share that wisdom with others is really a big takeaway for me. Thank you so much for your time today. Really appreciate
Peter,
it.
thank you.